On September 8th, 2017, 19-year-old Kanika Jenkins, along with her 3 friends, were driving to the Crown Plaza Hotel in Chicago, Illinois. It was a Friday night and the girls had been invited to a big birthday party on the 9th floor of the hotel. They arrived at the hotel around 11 p.m. and by the time they got up to room 926, the room was packed with their friends, the music was loud, and the drinks were flowing. A few hours into the party, a witness would tell police that when they went up to give Kanika a hug, she could barely stand, she was so intoxicated. Another witness said when everybody was up, dancing and having a great time, Kanika was sitting on the side of the room, apparently too drunk to even stand up. At about 3 a.m., Kanika and the 3 friends she had showed up with decided it was time to leave the party and head home. So they make their way into the hall, security cameras would pick them up in the hall, they go down to the lobby, and that's when Kanika realizes she doesn't have her car keys or her phone. Her friends, who were not nearly as intoxicated as Kanika, told her to stay in the lobby. They would go back up to the hotel room and look for her things. Her friends go back upstairs, they search the room for a few minutes, and they finally find her purse that had her cell phone and her keys in it. They go back down to the lobby and Kanika's not there. Now they assumed she must have already left the hotel and was waiting at the car for them, but when they got to the car, she wasn't there. So they all pile into the car and they call Kanika's mother and they say, hey, we just left this party and I think everything's fine, but we can't find Kanika and we have her phone and we have her keys. And they explained that they had left the party and she'd lost them and that she was down in the lobby and now she wasn't here anymore. And Kanika's mom wanted to know, were you guys drinking? And it was clear the friends were a little bit cagey about it. And they said, oh no, maybe a drink or two, but I'm sure she's fine. Everything's just fine. And Kanika's mom just felt like there's something off here. It's the middle of the night. You don't know where my daughter is. And so she said she was coming to the hotel and she was going to find Kanika. Kanika's mom arrives at the hotel around 5 a.m. And the first thing she does is she goes in and talks to the front desk manager and says, hey, my daughter was here. They were having a party up on the 9th floor and her friends can't find her. I'm sure she's fine, but would you mind using the security footage to show us where she went? Because we don't know if she left the hotel or if she's still here. Would you mind showing us the footage? And the hotel was totally unhelpful. They were like, well, we can't show it to you unless there's an official missing person report. Which, by the way, is a complete fabrication. That's not true. They could have showed it to her, they just didn't want to. And so they told her, sorry, you're gonna have to file a missing person report. And so obviously Kanika's mother is very frustrated and she just wants to find her daughter. So she leaves the hotel and she calls police. And she asks them, can you please come down to this hotel and get them to show us the security footage because we can't find my daughter. The police were willing to help, but they viewed this as, your daughter was at a party, she's probably with her friends somewhere, she's bound to show up, she probably went to another room, and they advised her that she should just wait a couple of hours, see if your daughter turns up, and if she doesn't, call us back. Kanika's mom is now doubly frustrated that there's no one who's going to help her, and so she decides that she's going to search for her daughter on her own. And so she goes back into the hotel and she goes up to the 9th floor and she begins going room to room, knocking on every single door and seeing if Kanika is inside or if anybody knows anything about Kanika. And so for hours, her mom goes room by room, floor by floor, and is getting nowhere until at 1:15 p.m., this is now 10 hours after Kanika left the party and vanished, the hotel finds out Kanika's mom is going door to door and they call the police on her and say she needs to leave, she's trespassing now. Police show up to deal with Kanika's mother, who sees the police and says, can you please just ask them to show you the security footage? My daughter's been missing for 10 hours now. I have her phone, I can't get in touch with her. And the police say, okay, fine. They go to the front desk, they say, show us the security footage. They show them the footage, but it's just the exits of the hotel. And they see Kanika going inside, but they don't see anybody leaving. And I guess that was enough for the police and the hotel. And they said, hey, we did our job. She apparently is still in the hotel somewhere, but we can't help you anymore. And no one looked anymore at the footage. And so Kanika's mom is once again now not even allowed to be in the hotel, and no one's reviewing the footage. And so she's got nothing she can do. Police would go back though that night at 10 p.m., so 17 hours after Kanika has gone missing, to review the footage again. And they start sifting through other footage beyond just the exits, and they discover Kanika stumbling through the hotel at 3:20 in the morning. She leaves the lobby and makes her way downstairs to the basement. She walks down the hall and can barely stand, and she goes into the kitchen. And then when she's in the kitchen, she kind of stumbles through the kitchen and then vanishes out of sight. When the police are not able to see Kanika on any other camera after she goes into the kitchen, They decide to just go down to the kitchen and look for her in there. And so at 12:48 a.m. on Sunday now, this is almost 24 hours after she's gone missing, they discover Kanika. She had stumbled into a walk-in freezer that was left open for reasons we don't know, and then once inside, she'd accidentally shut the door, but she was too drunk to open it up again, and she froze to death. Although Kanika's death was ultimately ruled an accident, one could make the case that had the hotel allowed Kanika's mother to review the footage just 2 hours after Kanika went missing, perhaps she would have found the footage that led them to the kitchen. They could have gone down and found her before she froze to death, but we'll never know. Here is the final footage of Kanika stumbling through the hotel before she ultimately landed in the freezer. In 1985, 17-year-old Michelle Avila, who just went by the nickname Missy, was a high school junior living in the working-class town of Arleta, California, which is located just north of Los Angeles, California. Despite Missy being very physically small, she was under 5 feet tall and barely weighed 95 pounds, she had a big presence about her, and it made her very popular at her school. Not only was she incredibly beautiful, with boys and girls falling over themselves to try to win her affection, but also Missy was just very kind and gentle and didn't seem to take herself very seriously. But life for Missy was not all perfect. A year earlier, during her sophomore year, a nasty rumor had been spread around Missy's high school that Missy had apparently been sleeping with all of these boys who were in established relationships with girls in the school. And even though this rumor was a total lie, by the time the rumor reached the girlfriends of these boys that Missy had apparently slept with, these girls believed it. And so to get their revenge on Missy, one day after school when she had walked outside, this group of girls ganged up on her and beat her really, really badly. In fact, the beating was so severe that when Missy came home, her family immediately pressed charges on the girl that seemed to kind of lead the attack. Her name was Sonia Bond. But despite Missy and her family immediately filing these charges, the case dragged for months and months and months. But finally, by October 1st, 1985, so at the beginning of Missy's junior year, Missy was within a week of actually going to court and taking the stand and testifying against Sonia. And while Missy was certainly nervous about going to court and testifying, she knew deep down she was making the right decision. On October 1st, so a week before Missy is set to testify, Missy came home from school and she told her mom that she had plans that afternoon to go hang out with her friends. This was fairly routine for Missy, who had a big circle of friends, and so her mother, Irene, told her that was totally fine, but you gotta be home by 6 p.m. Missy agreed, and then just a couple of minutes later, a 17-year-old girl named Laura Doyle, who was very close with Missy, she pulled up outside of Missy's house and she honked the horn. And so Missy heard her, she said goodbye to her mom and to her brother, and then she left the house, ran to Laura's car, hopped inside, and the two girls drove off. A few hours later, at 6 p.m., Missy had still not come home yet. However, her mother, Irene, was not that surprised. Missy was not really a troublemaker, but she really liked staying out with her friends, and so it wasn't that uncommon for her to stay out past curfew and then come home and ask for forgiveness, or she would stay out past curfew and then she would call her mother and ask for more time. And shortly after 6 p.m., the phone rang inside of Missy's house. And so Irene, she hears the phone ringing and she's expecting it to be her daughter. And so she walks over, she picks the phone up and says, "Hello," but it's not her daughter. It's another young girl's voice. It's Laura's voice, the girl who had picked Missy up after school to go hang out with friends. And before Irene could ask Laura why she was calling, Laura kind of awkwardly asked Irene, "Hey, is Missy home?" And Irene would say, "Laura, she left with you. Isn't she with you?" "No, she's not here. She's running late. Why? What's going on?" After Irene said this, Laura began to panic, and then she proceeded to tell Irene what happened that afternoon while she was out with with her daughter. She said after she picked Missy up, the two of them just kind of drove around town, which they did all the time, and then at some point they made their way over to Stonehurst Park, where Missy and Laura and a bunch of their friends would often go and hang out. And so they drove over to Stonehurst, they made their way into the parking lot, and as soon as they were in there, Laura began looking around for other cars that she recognized to see if maybe their friends were there. But after looking around, she didn't recognize any of the cars, and so Laura just reflexively began turning the car around to leave the park. But as she was doing that, Missy stopped her and said, "Wait a minute, I know the guys over there, I want to go say hi." And so Laura stopped the car and she looked in the direction that Missy was pointing, and on the far side of the parking lot were these two guys who appeared to be maybe in their late teens, early 20s. Laura did not recognize either of them, and they were standing outside of this blue car, a blue Camaro. Now, Laura was accustomed to Missy just kind of knowing everybody in town because everybody loved Missy and Missy loved everyone. And so this type of situation was not totally uncommon. However, Laura was just not very excited at the prospect of going and hanging out with these two total strangers to her. But she could tell Missy really wanted to, and so she turns to Missy and says, "Okay, go out there, go say hi to them, and I'm gonna park and I'll meet you in a second." And so Missy, she hops out of the car and she begins walking over to these two guys and she's waving to them, and they're waving back and smiling at her. And Laura, meanwhile, pulls the car into a parking spot, she throws it in park, and she's about to get out when she notices her gas gauge is below empty. And so she calls out to Missy, who's now halfway to these two guys, and she says, "Hey, I'm gonna go fill my car up with gas, and then I'll come back and I'll meet you." And so Missy turns around and she's like, "Okay, bye." And so Laura puts her car back in drive and she pulls out of the lot and she heads into town to get some gas. A few minutes later, when Laura pulled back into the Stonehurst parking lot, she looked in the direction of where the blue Camaro and the two guys were and where Missy was headed, and they're all gone. Missy is nowhere to be seen. Now, this was 1985, so Laura could not just call or text Missy to see where she had gone. And so instead, Laura just sat in the parking lot looking at the vacant spot where the blue car had been, kind of going over in her mind what she should do. And eventually, she told herself that, you know what, Missy was a big girl, she can handle herself, she knew those guys, I'm sure everything is just fine, and those guys will drop her off at her house when she needs to go home. And so even though Laura is telling herself this, she would leave the Stonehurst parking lot and spend a while just kind of driving around town looking for Missy and looking for this blue Camaro and these two guys, and after finding none of them, she would head home. And then right after 6 p.m., Laura picked up the phone and she called Missy's house because she knew Missy's curfew was 6 p.m. and so she should be home by now. But of course, when Missy's mother, Irene, picked up the phone, Laura would learn Missy had not come home. And so Irene and Laura are immediately really worried about Missy, but not to the point where either of them think they should involve the police. Instead, Laura and Irene would spend the next couple of hours after that 6 p.m. phone call calling everybody they could think of that might know where Missy was. And when that yielded no results, Laura and Irene actually met up that night and began going door to door to all of Missy's friends and acquaintances' houses, asking the occupants if they knew where Missy was. But by late that night, no one had given them any information about Missy's whereabouts, and so still feeling very concerned about Missy, Laura and Irene decided the best thing to do was just to go back home and go to bed and hope in the morning Missy turned up or someone contacted them with information about where Missy was. But the following morning, Missy had still not turned up and no one had heard from her. And so that morning, Irene went to the police and told them what was going on. Immediately, the police honed in on Laura and began going over every single detail of what that blue Camaro was doing, what those two guys looked like, what did Missy say about these two guys? Did she give any information about where they might go or who these guys were? And Laura, she was totally guilt-ridden and emotional about being the last person to see Missy before she has apparently vanished. And she sat there trying to give every bit of information she possibly could about what had happened that day. But unfortunately, she was just too far away from these two guys and their vehicle. She could only give them a sort of basic physical description, which Laura even admitted was not very accurate because it was really far away, and frankly, she wasn't looking that hard. And so after getting all the information they possibly could from both Laura and Irene, the police launched a very extensive search all over Arleta, California, and the surrounding areas. And while they were doing that, Irene and other members of Missy's Missy's family, along with Laura and other close friends of Missy's, began their own search. But after a couple of days, neither the professional search nor the amateur search had turned up any new information about Missy's whereabouts or the whereabouts of those two guys and their blue Camaro. But then on October 4th, just 3 days after Missy went missing, Missy would be found. However, it would take investigators another 3 years to finally make sense of what actually happened to her. Based on eyewitness testimony, here is a recreation of what happened to Missy on the day she vanished. On that day, which was Tuesday, October 1st, 1985, Missy came back from school. She told her mother she wanted to go out and hang out with her friends. Her mother told her, okay, be home by 6. And then a couple of minutes later, Laura pulled up outside and honked the horn, and Missy ran outside, hopped in the car, and they drove off. The pair would drive around town for a few minutes before making their way to Stonehurst Park. Now, to understand what happens next, you need some context. Missy had two best friends. One of them was 17-year-old Laura Doyle, who she was with, and the other was another 17-year-old girl named Karen Severson. These three girls had met when they were in grade school, they lived basically on the same street, and they spent virtually every second of every day together. However, a month earlier in September, the trio had had a falling out because a month earlier, another rumor about Missy sleeping with boys who had girlfriends began circulating around the school, except this time, the girlfriends in the rumor were Laura and Karen. Now, of course, Laura and Karen were well aware of the fact that a year earlier, Missy had been accused of something similar and it had all been a big lie. And so going into this new rumor, Laura and Karen knew that the likelihood of it being real was very slim. But because this rumor directly involved them and their boyfriends, they felt a little concerned. And so Laura and Karen went to Missy and they said, hey, we don't think it's true, but is it true? Did you sleep with our boyfriends? And Missy immediately is like, are you kidding me? No, I didn't sleep with your boyfriends. Did you see what happened last year? It's the same thing. It's a lie. It's just a rumor. I can't believe you would think I would do that to you. And so pretty quickly, this discussion escalated to a full-blown fight between the girls. Or more specifically, it turned into a full-blown fight between Karen and Missy. Because Laura, she was worked up about it, but pretty quickly she was able to calm down. But Karen, she didn't calm down. Because apparently Karen had seen Missy at some point flirting with her boyfriend, and so when this rumor began to circulate, Karen felt like, you know what? It could be true. She might have had sex with my boyfriend. And so eventually, the three girls just stopped fighting. Not because they had reached some sort of compromise, but rather because Missy just tried to turn around and walk away. And when she did, Karen wound up and slapped her across the face. And as soon as that happened, all three girls knew a line had been crossed, and now their decade-long friendship was potentially ruined. Over the next couple of weeks, Missy and Laura were able to come together and patch things up, but Missy and Karen continued to avoid each other. However, the distance between them really wore on both of them, and so finally, on the morning of October 1st, Karen would reach out to Missy and she would apologize. And Missy was really touched by this, and before long, Missy and Karen and Laura had made plans for that afternoon to meet up at Stonehurst Park to have a good day together, just like old times. So that afternoon, Laura picks up Missy from her house, and the two of them drive around for a bit before heading over to Stonehurst Park, where they're planning to meet Karen. But when Laura pulls the car into the parking lot, they look around and Karen is not there. And the blue Camaro and those two guys standing around it on the far side of the parking lot, they weren't there either. Because Laura had made up the blue Camaro and those two guys. They never existed. That was all just a big cover-up for what happens next. So Laura and Missy, they pull into the parking lot at Stonehurst and they park in a spot and proceed to wait for Karen. And Karen would show up just a couple of minutes later. But when she showed up, all hell broke loose. Karen came flying into the parking lot and came to a screeching stop right up alongside Laura's car. Karen had parked her car so close to Laura's car that Laura literally couldn't open her door without striking Karen's car. And in Karen's car, in the passenger seat, which was closest to Laura's car, was a terrified looking 17-year-old named Eva Cherambolo, who was friends with all three of the girls. And that day, Karen had apparently asked Eva to come over for dinner, but after picking Eva up, Without giving her any explanation, she had flown over to Stonehurst and then came to this screeching stop right next to Laura's car. And so Eva is sitting in the passenger seat looking at Karen and looking over at Laura, and Missy having no idea what's going on, and Karen begins yelling at Eva to roll her window down. And so Eva rolls her window down, and Laura and Missy are looking over in absolute astonishment. And then once the window is down on Eva's side, Karen begins screaming across Eva out the window at the car that Laura and Missy are in. And so Laura and Missy exchange totally confused looks, and then Laura rolls her window down, and suddenly Laura and Missy can hear what Karen is yelling. And Karen is hurling the most vile and horrible insults at Laura, not at Missy. It takes Laura a second to realize what Karen is yelling about, but once she realizes that Karen is just ruthlessly insulting her, Laura just turns and begins hurling insults back at Karen. And so the whole time, Laura and Karen are just screaming at each other. Missy and Eva are just sitting in their respective passenger seats, having no clue what's going on. And just as quickly as Karen had arrived and begun screaming at Laura, Karen put her car back in drive and sped right out of the parking lot. And Laura, at this point, is totally incensed and enraged at Karen for some of the things she had said. And so Laura fired up her car, threw it in drive, and before Missy could tell her otherwise, Laura had sped out of the parking lot after Karen. And for the next 45 minutes, Karen and Laura drove like absolute maniacs north of the city up into the mountains, where the whole time they're driving, Karen is swerving side to side and she's speeding along these desolate roads, and Laura would speed up and get right on her bumper like she was experiencing this extreme case of road rage. Now, for the first few minutes of this, both Missy and Eva were desperately trying to get their drivers to calm down and just pull over. Whatever you're fighting about, it's not worth crashing and dying over. But little did Missy or Ava know, there was something much, much bigger going on between Laura and Karen. And so their requests to stop the cars fell on deaf ears. Finally, after this 45-minute white-knuckle insane drive along these mountain roads came to an end when the road they were on kind of funneled them into this dirt parking lot in the middle of this huge forest. And as soon as they reached this parking lot, Karen came to a stop, and Laura narrowly avoided smashing into her and came to a stop right next to her. And as soon as the two cars were stopped, both drivers hopped out and were immediately in each other's faces, shoving each other, screaming at each other, just continuing this awful fight. Eva just stayed in the passenger seat and did nothing. She was just hoping that whatever was going on would eventually end and they could leave. But Missy, she's looking out there at her two best friends who seem like they're about to kill each other. And so Missy decides she's gonna get out and try to separate them. And so she begins to open her car door, and the second she does, both Karen and Laura, who were maybe 5 or 6 feet away from her car door, they both immediately stopped fighting. It was like a switch had been thrown, and whatever was going on had come to a complete and total stop. And at the same time they have suddenly stopped fighting, both girls simultaneously turn and look at Missy. And before Missy could say or do anything, Karen and Laura ran over and positioned themselves right outside of Missy's door. So Missy could no longer shut the door, and Missy could not get out of the car. She was totally trapped. And as soon as Karen was in position right outside of the car, Karen kind of got down and got right in Missy's face, and with a very menacing and hissing voice, she looks at Missy and says, "You know, this whole thing was a joke. Me and Laura, we weren't actually fighting. We're not mad at each other, but we are mad at someone. We're mad at you." And then Karen and Laura would reach down and pull Missy out of the car, and they would slam her back up against the side of Laura's car. And then Laura and Karen pressed up against her and began screaming at Missy that she had slept with their boyfriends, and they knew it. And this whole time, Missy is trying to tell them, "No, I didn't. I did not sleep with your boyfriends. I don't know what's going on." But at some point, Karen and Laura were screaming so loudly, and they were right on top of her, that Missy just kind of began to shut down, and she went quiet and kind of tucked herself into a ball. And as soon as this happened, Karen and Laura, they grabbed Missy and they began pushing her away from the car towards a trail that led into the forest. And Missy, she's 4'10", 95 pounds. She's tiny. And Karen was 5'2", over 200 pounds. And Laura was 5'6" inches tall and weighed 135 pounds. And so Missy knew she could not put up a fight. She had no chance against these two. And so Missy just kind of began shuffling her feet, walking towards this trail. And periodically, Karen and Laura would walk up and push her to walk towards this trail. And as this is happening, Eva, who had been sitting in the car the whole time, she finally got out and kind of walked up behind the group, but didn't participate. She just walked along behind them. And so after a couple of minutes, Karen and Laura had managed to push Missy all the way to the actual start of the trail, this narrow trail that left the parking lot. And at that point, Laura walked around Missy, so she was in front of her, and Karen stayed behind Missy. And the two girls ordered Missy to keep following them into the woods. And Missy did not put up a fight. She just put her head down and continued walking along the trail behind Laura, with Karen behind her, periodically pushing her, and then several steps behind Karen was Eva, who just continued to do nothing. After the girls had walked for a little while on this trail and were out of sight of the parking lot, Laura came to an abrupt stop and she turned around to face Missy. And by this point, Missy was genuinely terrified. She was crying, she had her head down, and she was just hoping that her captors were going to let her go. But once they stopped and Missy looked up at Laura, Laura wound up and decked Missy right in the face. And as soon as she hit Missy, Karen immediately jumped in. And before long, Missy was on the ground getting punched and kicked and stomped on by Laura and Karen. And again, Eva just stood there watching, doing nothing. Eventually, Laura and Karen would stop beating Missy. And at that point, Laura would pull out a knife and she would reach down and she would grab Missy's hair and she began hacking it off. Missy was not a vain person, but she loved her hair. It had to be perfect anywhere she went. It was her prized possession, and Laura and Karen knew it. And so Laura, she begins hacking off the hair with her knife, and Karen, who wanted to get involved but didn't have a knife, just began grabbing Missy's hair and ripping it out with her fists. Finally, after much of Missy's hair had been hacked off of her head, Laura and Karen stopped and just stood up and looked down at Missy, who was now in the fetal position just crying to herself. But Laura and Karen were not done. At this point, they got out restraints and they tied Missy's hands behind her back and they gagged her mouth. And again, Eva did nothing. Once Missy was completely restrained, Laura got up and began walking towards a nearby stream that was about 10 feet away from them down a hill. And so Laura gets down to the stream, she wades in about halfway where the water comes up about 8 inches on her leg, and then she turns around and she looks up the hill at Missy and Karen and Eva, who's off to the side. And Laura, while staring directly at Missy, she reaches down and begins running her fingers through the water and says to Missy, "Why don't you come down and get in the water with me?" When Missy didn't move, Karen, who was standing next to her, hauled her up and then pushed her down the hill. And Missy doesn't have the ability to brace her fall because her hands are bound, and so she slams down on her face and she rolls down to the edge of the water, and there she stops. And before Missy can get up, Karen and Laura had descended on her, they'd grabbed her by the shoulders, and they began dragging her out into the water. And so Eva, who's watching this happen, again does nothing and just turns around and begins running down the trail back towards the cars. When she gets to the cars, she discovers they are both locked, so she can't go anywhere, and she was too far away from anywhere to walk, and so her only choice was just to go back down the trail to where her friends were. And so Eva goes back to this trail and she begins walking in the direction of the stream, and as she's walking, before she can see any of the girls, she hears a terrifying, blood-curdling scream coming from somewhere deep in the forest. And Eva was so terrified that she stopped where she was, she turned around, and she ran back to the cars. Eva would sit down on the ground between the two cars, and she would begin to rock back and forth. After nearly an hour of doing that, Karen and Laura suddenly emerged from the trailhead, soaking wet and laughing. Missy was not with them. After Ava had turned around and run away from the stream to go back to the cars the first time, Laura and Karen had grabbed Missy, dragged her into the water, and laid her on her stomach in the 8 inches of water. And so Missy is trying desperately to keep her head out of the water, but Laura comes around and grabs her legs and presses them into the water, and then Karen comes around and grabs the back of Missy's head and forces her head down into the water. Missy would start fighting for her life, trying to wriggle her way out of the water, water, and at some point she would manage to get out from under their grasp, and as soon as her head cleared the water, she took in a big breath and then let out that piercing, horrifying scream that Ava heard as she was walking back down the trail, which scared her and caused her to run away again. And after Missy let out that primal scream, Karen readjusted her grip and pressed her head back into the water. Missy would continue to squirm and fight against Karen and Laura, and periodically she'd get her head up out of the water just enough to get a little gulp of air, and then she'd choke down a bunch of water and have her head pushed down into the water again. Until finally, Missy's strength just started to ebb. And when Karen and Laura sensed that Missy was on the verge of death and she was very weak, they seized the opportunity and they leapt off of her just long enough to run over to the side of the stream where there was this big, heavy log, which investigators would later determine weighed over 100 pounds. So it weighed more than Missy, and Karen and Laura, they'd pick this log up, they'd walk back into the stream, and they'd drop the log directly on the back of Missy's head, forcing it down into the water permanently. A few minutes after drowning Missy in the stream, Karen and Laura walked out of the trail, they got into their cars, Eva climbed into Laura's car, and the girls just left the parking lot and drove back home, leaving Missy in the woods. 3 days later, a group of hikers were in that forest near where Missy had been killed, and they spotted her body in the stream. When police arrived, they found cigarette butts, a beer bottle, and men's overalls lying out near where Missy was found. These items were there entirely coincidentally. They had nothing to do with what happened to Missy, but they somehow made the lie about Missy being with those two guys in their Camaro before she vanished seem more believable. Mostly because when Laura described these two guys to police, she kind of made it seem like they were bad boys or troublemakers, like the type of guys who would go off into the woods and smoke and drink for fun. And so the police just continued to chase down this two guys and a blue Camaro lead until the murder case went cold. But 3 years after Missy was murdered, Eva, who had been threatened by Karen and Laura never to say a word about what she knew, finally came forward to police and told them that Karen and Laura had killed Missy. When Karen, Laura, and Missy became teenagers, Missy really blossomed into this beautiful young woman who everybody seemed to adore. Meanwhile, Laura and Karen had the opposite experience. They felt awkward in their bodies and felt like no one really liked them. And so in time, they became very jealous of Missy, and that jealousy turned into resentment, and that resentment turned into hatred. And so in 1984, it was Karen and Laura who started that rumor about Missy sleeping with all these boys who had girlfriends. And that lie would get Missy attacked and beat up really badly. But that wasn't enough for Karen and Laura. They felt like Missy deserved worse. And so the following year, in September of 1985, Laura and Karen decided to kill Missy. Their plan began with spreading another rumor about Missy, about how she was sleeping around with boys with girlfriends, except this time the girlfriends in this rumor would be Laura and Karen. They did this knowing this rumor would start a fight between the three of them, and they knew that Missy just would not be able to be mad at her friends. She would want to make up with them. And so Karen and Laura, they start this rumor. It does cause a big blowout fight between the three of them, but then after this fight, Laura very intentionally makes up with Missy and kind of says, hey, let's make things right again. And so she pretends to be friends with Missy. And then a couple of weeks later, on the morning of October 1st, Karen would contact Missy. She would tell her how sorry she was. And she asked her, hey, do you want to get together today, all three of us, just like old times? And Missy fell right into their trap because she was so excited at the prospect of getting to spend time with her two best friends who she really did love. And so she quickly agreed to meet up with them. And so Laura and Missy, they arrive in the parking lot of Stonehurst Park, and then Karen comes flying in, and there's this huge fight, and there's this 45-minute drive up into the mountains where they reach this parking lot, and Karen and Laura are fighting with each other, and Missy has no idea what's going on, and then all of a sudden, the fighting stops. Because the fighting wasn't real. It was all rehearsed. Laura and Karen had done that in order to throw Missy off guard and to get her up into this forest up in the mountains where they could kill her. It's unclear why Laura and Karen brought Eva along, but most likely she was brought along as a decoy as well. After Missy's body was found and the police were on this mad hunt to find these two guys and the blue Camaro, Karen actually moved in to Missy's family's home. She told them she just wanted to offer support during this really difficult time, but in reality, she just wanted to keep close tabs on the investigation, and any chance she got, she wanted to make sure she threw police and Missy's family off of her and Laura's trail. And so for months, Karen slept in Missy's bed. She ate at the same dinner table where Missy would eat with Missy's family, and Karen would spend hours out in the car with Missy's mother, Irene, and other members of Missy's family, driving around looking for clues about where Missy could have gone or who really was responsible for Missy's death. When the truth finally came out 3 years later that Karen and Laura had been the ones who killed Missy, Missy's family could not believe that their daughter's killer was literally living with them the whole time. Ultimately, Laura and Karen would be found guilty of killing Missy, and they would each be sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Karen Severson was paroled in December of 2011, and Laura Doyle was paroled a year later in December of 2012. In early December of 1985, in the Chattahoochee National Forest in northern Georgia, a hunter was very carefully making his way through the trees trying to track a deer. Now, this hunter had been tracking this deer for over a mile, but it had been a while since he had seen any signs of it being anywhere nearby. And as this hunter continued to creep along, he became increasingly aware of how loud each of his steps were, because the ground all around him was covered in dry leaves, and so every step he was taking was creating a loud crunching sound. And so eventually this hunter just came to a stop and decided stalking this deer was totally pointless because he was basically scaring it away with these crunching sounds as he got closer to it. But before this hunter was ready to just give up and head back to his vehicle, he continued on a little bit further, and when he pushed through this particularly dense brush area, he saw this clearing up ahead. And the second he saw what was in this clearing, he froze, took a step back into the brush, and then ducked down behind a rock. Because in that clearing, he saw an animal, and it wasn't a deer. It was a huge American black bear. Now, generally speaking, American black bears are not aggressive towards humans. However, if, for example, you were to accidentally sneak up on a black bear, like this hunter had done, and you suddenly startled it by just showing your presence, the bear might react by pouncing on you and ripping you to bits. And so this hunter, with his back pressed up against the rock and his rifle gripped tightly across his chest, he's thinking about that and wondering what he's gonna do to get out of this situation. At first he thought, okay, I'll just stand up and quietly walk away. But then he remembered how loud the leaves were, and even though he had been lucky walking in, he hadn't alerted the bear to his presence, on the way out, he was worried he wouldn't be so lucky, that those leaves would alert the bear to his position. And so the hunter began thinking, okay, well, what if I just stand up and start shooting at this bear? But the hunter knew the big issue with that plan is he had a deer hunting rifle, which is not nearly powerful enough to quickly take down a black bear, if at all. And so if he starts shooting at this bear, there was a very good chance that the bear would just turn around and maul him before he was able to put the bear down with his rifle. And so as this hunter is going through these scenarios behind the rock, he realizes something. He hasn't heard this bear at all. Now, bears in general are very loud animals. Just their regular breathing is so guttural and noisy that you can hear it a pretty good distance away. And the hunter's thinking to himself, I can't hear it breathing, and come to think of it, I haven't heard this bear once since I've been near it. And so the hunter very carefully stood up from behind his rock and turned around, and then he kind of peered forward into the brush, looking back into this clearing. And when he spotted the bear again, he realized immediately the bear was dead. The bear was kind of slumped forward, and its body almost looked like a deflated balloon. The hunter was so relieved, he almost started laughing. And so he stepped out from behind his rock and he made his way through the brush into the clearing to get a better look at this bear. And when the hunter was right over the top of this bear looking down at it, something immediately struck him as very odd. This bear was far too young to have died of natural causes. However, after this hunter kind of poked and prodded the bear and lifted it up on either side to try to look underneath it, he couldn't see any visible injuries. It was like this bear had just randomly dropped dead. But the hunter didn't spend much time thinking about what happened to this bear. Instead, he thought to himself, there has to be some sort of logical explanation for what killed it. And with one last look at the bear on the ground, the hunter turned around and began the long walk back through the woods back to his vehicle. It would turn out there was an explanation for what happened to that bear. However, it was anything but logical. But to get to that non-logical explanation, we first have to go back in time. Around 11:30 p.m. on September 10th, 1985, so 3 months before the hunter discovered this dead bear, two pilots were flying their little 6-seater Cessna airplane over northern Georgia, making their way north towards Tennessee. And as these pilots flew along very casually, they suddenly intercepted over their radio a voice message that they definitely were not supposed to hear. It sounded like other pilots communicating with each other, and what they were talking about was how they were now going to follow this little Cessna airplane that they could see that was currently flying over northern Georgia. Now, radio traffic like this can only really be intercepted if your radio that's doing the intercepting is physically close to the person doing the transmitting. And so knowing this, the two pilots in this little Cessna knew that whoever was talking about following that little Cessna, they had to be talking about them, the two pilots in that Cessna. Now, for most pilots, if you suddenly overheard a radio transmission that your plane was getting followed by some other pilots, you might reach out to those pilots and say, "Hey, why are you following me? What's going on?" Now, the co-pilot of this little Cessna might have wanted to react that way. However, before he could, the main pilot stopped him and said, "I actually know exactly why somebody might want to tail us, and unfortunately, we're both gonna have to jump out of this plane." Before the co-pilot could really even react to this news, the main pilot had set the Cessna on autopilot, which sets the plane to fly in a straight direction, going at a constant speed, at a constant altitude, until either a pilot comes back and takes the craft back over, or if it just stays on autopilot, it eventually will run out of fuel and crash or run into something. And so after the main pilot had done that, he turned to the co-pilot and gestured for him to come with him into the main cabin of the aircraft, basically the main body of the craft where all their luggage was. And the co-pilot, he's so confused about what's happening, he's so panicked that he just follows the main pilot. So the two of them, they climb back over the two front seats, they go into the main body of the craft, and the main pilot begins strapping parachutes onto some of their luggage. And as he's doing this, he tells the co-pilot to open up the side door of the plane. And so again, the co-pilot is just so caught off guard, he has no idea how to handle this, and so he reaches over and he slides open this door of this moving plane. And as soon as he did, this huge rush of cold night air blasted inside of the cabin, and it became so loud from the howling wind coming in that the two pilots couldn't even talk to each other. And then the main pilot just began pushing the luggage out of the plane just into the night, falling straight down to the ground far, far below them. And at some point, the co-pilot just joined him and began pushing the luggage out of the plane. And then after all the luggage was out, the main pilot shoved a parachute into the hands of the co-pilot and said, put it on. He had to gesture for it because they couldn't hear each other. And so as this co-pilot's struggling to get on his parachute, the main pilot puts on his chute, and then right after the co-pilot has just barely got his parachute on, the main pilot pushes him out the side of the plane, and then the main pilot jumps out after him. So they basically abandoned their plane, which was still set to autopilot, so at some point, it was just going to crash. About 5 hours later, in a suburb of Knoxville, Tennessee, an 85-year-old man named Fred Myers was just waking up. Fred always got up before sunrise. It was part of his daily routine. He would wake up, he would get dressed, he would wash and shave his face, and then he would sit down and read the local newspaper. This simple routine was actually very important to Fred because recently he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which is a progressive disease that destroys memory. And so having this sort of set routine helped him manage his symptoms. Basically, at least in the morning, he could go into autopilot and go through this routine and not get confused. However, on this particular morning, something would happen that would leave Fred more confused than he had ever been in his entire life. Fred had made it to his bathroom, he had washed his face, and he had begun shaving when out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something strange outside in his driveway. He could see it through a nearby window, but it was still so dark outside, Fred couldn't tell what this thing was out there. And so feeling very curious, Fred put his razor blade down and he made his way over to the window to get a better look. And when he reached the window and looked out at his driveway and saw what this strange thing was, he could not believe his eyes. There was this huge parachute out on his driveway, and on the parachute was the main pilot of the Cessna. After the main pilot had pushed the co-pilot out and leapt out himself, when he pulled his ripcord, his chute either didn't deploy, or when it deployed, it didn't inflate fully, and so he was forced to go to his reserve chute, but it didn't inflate fast enough to stop him from crashing into the ground. And so the main pilot slammed into the ground, basically at terminal velocity, and so he sustained catastrophic internal injuries, and he died within a couple of minutes of hitting the ground. Fred was so stunned and confused at what he was looking at that without saying a word, he just turned away from his window and walked over to his phone and called the police, shaving cream still on his face. When the police arrived at Fred's house that morning, they were expecting to see a dead recreational skydiver on Fred's property. But when they walked up the driveway and saw the dead man for themselves, they knew right away this was not some recreational skydiver. He actually looked more like a soldier. He was wearing a bulletproof vest over some camouflage fatigues, and he had night vision goggles strapped to his head. But the dead man's shoe choice made the police think this guy could not possibly have been military, because on this guy's feet were not military-style combat boots like you would expect with the rest of his getup. Instead, he was wearing loafers, specifically Gucci loafers, so very expensive designer shoes. And so the police are thinking to themselves, who the heck was this guy and what was he doing? The police would figure that out. However, first, we have to fast forward 2 months to late November 1985, so roughly 2 weeks before that bear was discovered by that hunter in Chattahoochee National Forest. Now, at this point in late November, that black bear was alive and well and living a typical black bear life in the Chattahoochee National Forest, which meant he mostly spent his time wandering around the woods looking for something to eat. And on this particular day in November, the bear was doing just that when out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something strange lying on the forest floor. It was one of the pieces of luggage that the two pilots had pushed out of their plane. It was this big, heavy duffel bag. Now, the bear had no idea if this duffel bag contained food, but the bear was optimistic, so it meandered its way over and began pawing at the bag with its massive claws, and pretty much immediately, his claws tore open a hole in this bag. And suddenly, the air all around this bear was filled with this glorious, flowery smell, so the bear put its nose directly into this rip in the bag and began sniffing and licking the contents of this bag. And apparently, the bear just loved it because it ate whatever was inside of the bag. All of it. And when he was done, the bear felt so good, he was so full of energy that he just started sprinting in a straight direction. And after running at top speed about 100 yards, every major system inside of this bear shut down all at once and he died on the spot, collapsing in that clearing. And then, about 2 weeks later, that hunter walked into the Chattahoochee National Forest and discovered this dead bear. And then, within 24 hours, the hunter was back home and he told one of his friends about discovering this dead bear. And when he told his friend about seeing this bear, he also kind of casually mentioned that he had seen a duffel bag in the forest not far from this dead bear. Now, to understand what this friend did next, you need some context. By this point in time, the police had actually figured out a lot about that dead man on Fred Myers' driveway, the main pilot of the Cessna. They knew he was a 40-year-old man named Andrew Thornton who had served in the U.S. Army as a paratrooper, but after getting out of the service, he had kind of gone astray in his life and become a big-time smuggler of illegal goods. The police had also figured out by this point that Andrew, along with a co-pilot, had been the people flying that Cessna that eventually was found crashed into a mountainside in North Carolina. The co-pilot had survived the jump out of the Cessna, and so the police tracked him down, and they very quickly realized this co-pilot was really just a victim of Andrew. Andrew had told this guy they were just gonna fly to the Bahamas for a vacation. And so when that plan completely evaporated, and suddenly Andrew is barking orders at this guy to open up the plane and push the luggage out and jump out, the co-pilot said he just totally panicked and just started doing whatever Andrew wanted. And so this guy was just totally terrified, and really all he could offer police was just to confirm that, yup, Andrew was the main pilot, and yes, we really did push his luggage out of the side of the plane over some forest in northern Georgia. The police believed the co-pilot and did not charge him with any crime. The police would go and search all over northern Georgia, and they would find the majority of the missing bags. However, they knew they were still missing some, and they knew they really needed to recover them. And so, around the time that this hunter is telling his friend about this bear encounter and this duffel bag, the police were constantly having news outlets tell people in northern Georgia that if you see one of these duffel bags attached to a big parachute or something, please come forward and tell us. We are looking for these. And so the hunter's friend thought, you know what? That duffel bag he mentioned out in Chattahoochee National Forest, which is in northern Georgia, might be one of those bags. And so the friend called authorities. Authorities were thrilled to get this tip, and so they charged out to the Chattahoochee National Forest, and they made their way out to where this dead bear was, and then sure enough, about 100 yards away from this bear was this bag, and it was one of the bags they were missing. Except the bag was empty, because, as we already know, that black bear had eaten everything inside of this bag. And as you might have guessed, that bag, along with every other bag that had been cast out of the Cessna that night, was full of cocaine. Because Andrew was a drug smuggler. And on the night he and his co-pilot leapt from the Cessna, he was trying to smuggle 900 pounds of cocaine from South America into the United States. That transmission that Andrew and the co-pilot suddenly overheard on their radio as they were cruising along in their Cessna was the sound of federal agents within the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency who had been tipped off about Andrew's big drug run, and so they really had sent 2 planes to go follow him and potentially intercept him. And so the authorities standing in the Chattahoochee National Forest looking down at this empty duffel bag had no idea where the cocaine went that was supposed to be inside of it. But on a hunch, they decided to bring the body of the dead black bear back with them and perform an autopsy on it. And sure enough, during this autopsy, the medical examiner would open up the bear's stomach, and the examiner would say the stomach was, quote, packed to the brim with cocaine, thus ending the mystery of how this bear died. It died from a massive, massive cocaine overdose. But the bear story did not end there. Normally, after an animal is autopsied, they are cremated. But for some reason, this medical examiner decided not to do that, and instead, he had the bear taxidermied, and then he gifted this taxidermied bear to the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area. And then from there, the bear changed hands many times. Over the next 2 decades, no one knows exactly who had the bear and for what reason, but there were reports that at least at one point it was stolen from a storage facility, and then it was sold at a pawn shop, and then at some point the bear was in the possession of famous country singer Waylon Jennings, and then finally the bear found its forever home. Today, the bear is on display at the Kentucky Fun Mall in Lexington, Kentucky, and around its neck is a placard that reads, "Cocaine Bear." On August 6th, 2018, a manager at a grocery store in Lancaster, California, which is a town about an hour north of Los Angeles, started getting complaints from his staff and from customers about a terrible smell coming from the front of the building. The manager, who had come in the back door that day and so hadn't smelled anything, began walking through the store towards the front in order to investigate. He only made it to the cash registers before he had to throw his arm over his mouth and his nose because the whole front half of the store reeked. The manager's first thought was that food must have somehow fallen somewhere out of view and it was rotting, and that was causing the smell. But when he went past the cash registers and went out the front doors, the smell got exponentially worse, and he noticed the smell was predominantly coming from this brown liquid on the ground that seemed to be leaking out of the base of one of the pillars that lined the front of the store. And so the manager thought, well, it can't be food that's causing the smell. It's got to be a sewer pipe leak that's happened right underneath this pillar, and it's seeping up through the cement, and that's what's causing the smell. And so the manager went back inside the store and he called a plumber, and then a couple of hours later, the plumber showed up. The manager pointed at the brown liquid out on the front and explained what he thought was going on, and the plumber looked at it and then looked at the manager and said, there's no sewer pipe underneath here, so whatever that liquid is, it's coming from inside the pillar. And so the manager was stumped because this pillar and all the others in the front of the store were purely decorative. There's no reason anything would be leaking out from inside of them. There was nothing inside of them. And so the manager asked the plumber to pull off one of the bricks around the area where this liquid was coming from so they could see what was on the other side. And so the plumber got his crowbar and he began prying off one of the bricks. And then once it was loose enough, he pulled the brick away, revealing an opening into the pillar. And the two men got down and they looked inside, and what they saw horrified them. And they immediately backed up and they called the police. 5 days earlier, a 35-year-old man named Ray Rivera was pulled over by Lancaster, California police on suspicion of driving a stolen vehicle. As soon as the officer got out of their cruiser and began approaching Ray's vehicle, Ray peeled off down the road, turned the corner, and was gone. The officer immediately got back in their cruiser and took off after Ray, but he had gotten a huge jump start and he had fled into a highly populated and busy area where it would be relatively easy to blend in and disappear. The officer called for backup, and before long, there were dozens of other cop cars in the area looking for Ray, but no one could find him. A little while later, the police heard over the radio that a car matching the description of the one Ray had been driving had just crashed into a local grocery store. And so the police head over to the grocery store, and sure enough, there's Ray's white pickup truck crashed into the side of the building, but Ray is nowhere to be found. The police began asking witnesses at the store if they had seen the man driving the white pickup truck, and a few said they had. They said after he crashed, he leapt out of the vehicle and he ran inside the grocery store and then went up a flight of stairs to the staff-only area. The police went inside the grocery store and searched the staff-only area, and they searched the rest of the grocery store, but he wasn't there. And so they assumed at some point after going inside, he managed to slip back out again and had escaped on foot. And so the police, just as a precaution, stayed outside of this grocery store for several more hours in case if Ray was in there, they would catch him trying to leave. But after a couple of hours, he never did. And so they put out a warrant for his arrest and they left. Well, it would turn out Ray had run inside the grocery store, but he had never left. After running up to that staff-only area, he found a crawl space and he hid inside of it for several hours until the police left. And then at some point that evening, he decided he wanted to find a better hiding spot, and so he made his way onto the roof. Now, it's not entirely clear how he did that. Either the crawl space he was in directly connected to the roof, or he got out of the crawl space and then found his way onto the roof another way. But regardless, he found his way onto the roof, and when he got up there, he realized the roof was totally flat until you got to the very front edge of the building, the part that looked down into the parking lot. There, on the roof, was this small structure that was built up just on the front end of the roof that gave the impression from the parking lot looking up that this building was a lot bigger than it really was. On the backside of this phony structure was a door that was accessible from the roof. Ray saw this access door and ran over to it. He tried the handle and it was unlocked. And so he opened it up and he went inside. Now, this attic-like space that sat on the front of the building really didn't have that much of a purpose to it. However, it did provide access to the insides of all of the pillars that lined the front of the store. And so it's believed that Ray, as soon as he walked inside, saw these openings and believed one of them would be the perfect hiding place. And so he lowered himself feet first into one of these hollow chutes. He got his feet and his legs, his hips, and most of his torso into this tight 9-inch by 17-inch space, but his shoulders were too broad. They would not fit into the pillar. And so he raised one arm over his head and he kept his other arm pinned by his side in order to make himself as narrow as possible. And this worked. Inch by inch, he began sliding deeper and deeper into this 2-story tall pillar until he was completely out of sight. But as soon as his shoulders had gone down into that pillar, he would have realized he had made a grave mistake. With one arm pinned above his head and the other pinned by his side, he would not have been able to pull himself back up out of this narrow space. He was stuck. And so he probably began squirming and trying to use his feet to try to get back up into the attic space, but all of that movement only made him slip farther and farther down into this pillar until his feet touched the ground at the absolute bottom. And so not only is he he already in this totally compromised position that would have made it hard to breathe? He was also in such a narrow space that the walls of this pillar literally were crushing his chest, making it nearly impossible to get a full breath of air. And when he screamed out for help, nobody would have heard him because he was entombed inside of multiple layers of cement and brick. Also, making an already horrible situation that much worse, Lancaster, California was experiencing a very significant heat wave that month. And so all day long, the sun would have been blazing down on the outside of that pillar, heating up the inside like an oven. 5 days after Ray got trapped, the plumber removed that brick on the pillar, and he and the store manager bent down and looked, and they saw Ray's leg. The smelly brown liquid that had been coming out of the pillar that had alerted everyone to this in the first place was purge fluid, which is something that comes out of a decomposing body. In the early morning hours before sunrise on April 12, 1990, a 31-year-old man named Nathan Neesmith pushed down on the gas throttle of the fishing boat that he was steering just off the coast of Georgia. And as he did this, he expected the boat to naturally kind of kick into a higher gear and go faster. But as he pushed that throttle down, nothing really happened, and the boat just kind of sputtered along, going about half the speed that he expected it to go. Confused, Nathan stepped away and began making his way out towards the deck, where his younger brother, Billy Joe, who was actually the captain of this fishing boat, was out there taking a nap. And Nathan figured, if there was any issue with the boat, Billy Joe was the guy to talk to. He would know how to fix it. Now, for context, the two brothers were on the first day of a 7-day fishing trip that actually Nathan was not supposed to be a part of. The crew was originally going to be Billy Joe, the captain, and the one who actually rented the boat, along with Billy Joe's nephew, and also 2 other commercial fishermen. But at the last second, those 2 other commercial fishermen had bowed out, and Nathan and a friend had volunteered to go to round out the crew. Now, Nathan and Billy Joe, they came from a fishing family, but it was really only Billy Joe who had pursued the family business. Now, Nathan was perfectly handy out on the water and did know how to fish and knew his way around a fishing boat, but compared to Billy Joe, there was a massive gap in experience. Billy Joe was the fisherman, and Nathan really was not. But Nathan and Billy Joe were very close, and so as soon as Nathan heard Billy Joe was in trouble and needed some more fishermen, Nathan didn't hesitate to say he would do it. Because really, for their entire lives, that was sort of their dynamic. Even though Nathan was the older brother, it was Nathan who looked up to Billy Joe, and any chance he got, he would do anything to help Billy Joe. And Billy Joe really respected that and loved that about Nathan. But now, as Nathan made his way out to the deck to wake his brother up to tell him on the first day of the trip, right as Nathan's taking the wheel, that something's wrong with the boat and I can't fix it. And also, Nathan was enormous, like 250 pounds, well over 6 feet tall. He was huge, this big physical presence, but he really was not mechanically savvy at all. And so again, Nathan is sort of feeling like, sorry, and also maybe even second guessing whether or not it was even a good idea for him to have come along. If he can't even fix a minor issue with the throttle or the engine, what's he doing here? But when Nathan woke up his younger brother and explained the issue, Billy Joe was not upset. He was like, okay, we'll go down below and we'll take a look at the engine and make sure everything is okay. However, when they went down and Billy Joe opened up this hatch to look at the engine, smoke immediately came out, and it was very clear to Billy Joe anyways, that this was not like a minor issue. Something seriously was wrong with the engine. This was a big problem. And so Billy Joe began cussing, he's totally frustrated, and he just told Nathan to, go down below and tell the other 2 to wake up and come help. And so huge Nathan turned around and went down into the bunk room down below, and the second he got down to that level of the fishing boat, he just stopped, because there was at least a foot of water in the hallway and in the bunk room when he went inside. And so Nathan screamed at the other 2 fishermen to get up, and so they got up and they're looking down, they're seeing all this water, and so they're starting to panic. And Nathan, he goes back upstairs and he yells to Billy Joe, who's dealing with this engine issue, that in addition to that, it appears the boat is also sinking. And so Billy Joe is like, get buckets, go down there and start bailing out the water. I'm gonna call Mayday. And so Billy Joe runs back up to the steering wheel, he grabs the radio, and Nathan and the others can hear him yelling over and over again, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And as that was happening, Nathan and the other 2 fishermen put on their life vests, grabbed buckets, and went down below to begin manually bailing out the water. But the second they got down there, it was very obvious the water, wherever it was leaking into this ship, was coming in way faster than they could potentially bail out. But they kept doing it, getting the water out as fast as they could, trying to stay calm. They can hear Billy getting more and more frantic, yelling Mayday over and over again. And then all the lights inside of the ship began to flicker, and then they went out, and they were cast into total darkness. The engine basically had stopped, and it was just silence, just the sound of water rushing into this boat. Also, Billy Joe had stopped yelling Mayday because clearly the boat had lost power and the radio didn't work. And unfortunately, before the power cut out, nobody had heard any of Billy Joe's Mayday calls. So nobody knew where they were, nobody knew they were sinking, and without power, they had no way to communicate to anybody. They were totally alone. So Nathan, Billy Joe, and the others did the only thing they could do. They went up to the main deck, they grabbed their inflatable life raft, they blew it up, chucked it over the side, they grabbed as many supplies as they could, put it in the raft, they all made sure they had all their flotation on, and then they jumped into the life raft, abandoning the sinking fishing boat. Now, once all 4 men were safely inside of this life raft, they were not as panicked as you might think they would be, because they had put enough food and water in this raft to last them at least several days. They all again had their life vests on, so proper flotation, and even though nobody responded to those Mayday calls, it wasn't impossible to think that maybe somebody had heard the Mayday calls and they just had not called back. Maybe there was a rescue operation coming to their location right now. They didn't know, but it felt plausible that they could be rescued. They would just need to kind of ration out their supplies and stay optimistic. However, their optimism quickly faded when, after only being in this life raft for 30 minutes, right as the sun was starting to come up, Nathan began to hear a strange sound. It was coming from somewhere in the life raft. He couldn't quite place the sound, and so at first he kind of tried to ignore it, but then he noticed the life raft was becoming softer, and then he realized the sound he heard was a small hiss. The raft had a leak. And even though the 4 men were able to trace the sound of this leak to the actual puncture, they didn't have a patch kit or any meaningful way to patch up this hole. And so all they could do was just put their hands over this leak and do their best to seal it. But it didn't stop the air from coming out. It just delayed it. And so over the next hour, again, as the sun is just coming up on the second day of their big fishing trip, the raft finally completely deflated, and all 4 men were suddenly bobbing in the freezing cold ocean, surrounded by the wreckage of their sinking fishing boat. And so eventually, the men grabbed the biggest piece of wood from the wreckage that came floating by, and it was buoyant enough that it kind of served as like a makeshift raft, but it wasn't buoyant enough to hold all 4 of them at once, which meant, they had to take turns resting on this raft, and then they'd have to get back in the ocean and kind of wait their turn again. Totally miserable. And as this was happening, they just stared at the hull of their sinking fishing boat that was still poking up out of the ocean, just drift farther and farther away from them because the current was pretty strong. And as they watched their ship just kind of disappear into the distance, and they're just kind of drifting out into the middle of the ocean, they were all just stunned into silence. They could not believe how this had happened and so quickly. And also, what were they gonna do? They're in the worst possible situation here. It just didn't seem possible that they could actually survive this. Now, for reference, even though the men had salvaged a lot of their food and water from the sinking life raft, and they had their flotation devices on, that didn't protect them from hypothermia. It wouldn't matter if it was super warm outside. What mattered is the ocean was really cold. And because they couldn't stay on that raft, they had to keep cycling through, going back in the ocean over and over again. It was just a matter of time before they would get hypothermia. And sometimes hypothermia can kick in just a couple of hours. We're not talking days here. This is gonna be quick. And all these guys knew that. And so as these men were forced to have these really morbid discussions around who's gonna stay in the water and who's gonna stay on the raft, Nathan made a drastic decision. Nathan, being by far the biggest physically out of the 4 men, he knew that if he wasn't there right now, the other 3 could easily fit on their makeshift raft and stay out of the water, delaying hypothermia, thereby increasing the odds that they got rescued. And so Nathan did what he always did, and he turned to his younger brother, who he looked up to so much, who he just wanted to help all the time, and Nathan told him, I'm gonna swim to the wreckage. I'm gonna swim back to the hull of our sinking ship, and I'm gonna fashion my own makeshift raft. That way you guys can have this one, and I'll have my own, and we can all get out of here in one piece. Now, keep in mind, it was fairly obvious that the hull of the sinking ship, which was barely visible near the horizon, was at least 3 miles away, just from their own rough calculations. So this is a monster swim to get to that. And so immediately, Billy Joe and the other 3 were like, no, that is a suicide mission. You cannot do that. Do not swim to the hull. You're not gonna make it. Now, just to give some additional context here, if you're not familiar with just how challenging swimming in the open ocean is, I'm gonna give you my limited experience. So when I was in the military, we had to do one 5.5 mile open ocean swim. And then also we did a whole bunch of 2 mile ocean swims. And even though we were allowed to use amazing wetsuits and fins, we had a swim partner with us. We had the land nearby to use as a reference to make sure we're going the right direction. We had food, we had water, we were in great shape. Even with all of that, open ocean swims are miserable. You get all this salt in your mouth and your nose, you start cramping and chafing. I mean, it takes hours and hours and hours to swim some of these distances, and you're constantly fighting against the waves. I mean, it is an absolute chore swimming in the open ocean, again, even with all the right stuff in place. And you gotta remember, Nathan is this big guy, he's got this big bulky life vest on that's gonna make it hard to swim. He doesn't have fins, he doesn't have a wetsuit, and he's got no landmarks around him, to make sure he's going in a straight line. Typically when you're swimming in the ocean, you're constantly looking at the land or some other landmark to make sure you're going in the right direction. He wouldn't have had that. And also it's this unknown distance he's covering, and there could be predators in the water. I mean, there's so many barriers here that basically there was like a 0% chance this swim would be successful. But Nathan totally understood what he was really doing here. He didn't really know if he was actually gonna make it to that boat. Frankly, that was not really the point. What he was really doing was choosing to sacrifice himself to potentially save his brother and the other two. And so even though they were telling him, do not go, do not swim in that direction, you're not gonna make it, Nathan just turned to his brother Billy Joe and said, I love you, and then he turned and began swimming. And by some miracle, 11 hours later, right as the sun was setting, Nathan was still alive and still swimming, and he did reach the sinking boat that still had its hull poking out of the water. Now, when Nathan got to the sinking ship, he was almost dead from dehydration, from hypothermia. I mean, he's miserable, but he's made it to his destination completely against all odds, and he climbed up onto this hull, and he found a spot on the hull of the ship that supported his weight, and he managed to tie himself using some rope or maybe his life vest to the hull, so he was anchored in place. And then he didn't get to sleep because the whole time he's thinking, this thing could sink under the water at any point and it will drag me with it because I'm tied to it, or he could just drift off of it if his rigging kind of came undone, if he was asleep. And so all night, beyond exhausted, he's just holding on to this hull, not really sure what's gonna happen, but here he is, just waiting it out. And then finally, when the sun came up that next morning, as Nathan looked around him, he's in the middle of the ocean, he sees in the direction he had come from this pillar of smoke coming up over the horizon. And so Nathan, he rubs his eyes, he can't believe it. He's thinking, there's no way, there's already a ship out here. We're in the middle of nowhere. But sure enough, slowly but surely, this massive freighter ship came into view that was very far away. It's not near Nathan, but he can see it clear as day. And where this ship was basically circling was roughly where he believed his brother and the other two fishermen were still floating. And so he's thinking, oh my goodness, the freighter is going to save them, and then it's going to come save me. And so Nathan just clung onto the hull and watched as this freighter made these big slow loops right around that same area. And then the freighter came to a full stop, and it appeared to lower something down into the water. It seemed very much like a full-blown rescue operation. And then about 3 hours after he first spotted this freighter, the freighter began to move again, and this time directly towards Nathan. Nathan was so relieved he could practically cry. But instead what he did is he thought, they're gonna be here in a minute. I'm finally just gonna close my eyes and go to sleep. And so he put his head down on the hull, looked one more time at the freighter, and then closed his eyes. Now, Nathan would be rescued, but it would not be by that huge freighter ship. Nathan eventually had opened his eyes after closing them for a second, and he saw this freighter that had been coming straight for him, at some point had kind of deviated and gone in the wrong direction and then vanished over the horizon, never to be seen again. And it would take 3 more days before a separate ship happened to find Nathan, they scooped him up, and they rescued him. But even though Nathan had been really crushed when that freighter had gone the wrong way, he held on to this idea that, that freighter had clearly rescued his brother and the other 2 fishermen. And certainly, even if they couldn't find him, they would go back and they would tell the authorities that Nathan is out there. We swam back to the hull of the ship. We got to go find him. And so certainly a rescue effort would be on the way. And it was true. A rescue boat had come out and found Nathan. So everything seemed to be tracking. And when Nathan woke up inside of his hospital room back on land, his friends and family were all by his bedside, and he's looking around. He can't believe he survived. And the first thing he asks is, how's my brother? How are the other 2 fishermen? And why didn't that freighter pick me up too? And at this, all the people in the room just kind of looked at Nathan with a very confused look on their face. And eventually they asked him a question that made Nathan burst out in tears. They said, "What freighter?" It would turn out Billy Joe and the other two fishermen were still missing at this point, and nobody had heard a thing about some big freighter in the area. As far as anybody knew, at least in Nathan's family, that freighter ship did not exist. The search for Billy Joe and the remaining two crew members went on for weeks and weeks, and while the active search out on the ocean was going on, the Coast Guard and police were searching through every record they could possibly find of basically any ship that was even roughly in the area where Nathan and the others had been. But despite looking everywhere, there was basically no sign that any ship of any kind had been there beyond the rescue operation that eventually scooped up Nathan. And so again, it seemed very likely that that freighter ship didn't exist, and it was possible that Nathan, in his very deteriorated state, had maybe hallucinated it. Although Nathan was adamant, he definitely saw that ship. It did not feel like, a multi-hour long hallucination. It felt like he was watching a ship. He was sure of it. But again, there was just no proof, and so nobody knew what to think of that. And then eventually, even though there was this huge search going on, there was just no sign of Billy Joe or the others, and so eventually the search was called off, and unfortunately, the presumption was Billy Joe and the other two were now dead. 5 months later, on the afternoon of October 5th, 1990, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home. Now, by this point, the victims' families had all tried to sort of restart their lives following this tragedy, but deep down, none of them could truly accept that Billy Joe and the other two fishermen were just gone. They just couldn't do it. It was too soon. It felt like, any moment they were going to get news that, they had been rescued by some freighter ship or something. And so anytime a phone rang in any of these families' homes, it's like they would rush to the phone with the sense of hope that this time it's going to be different. Their loved ones are going to be okay, only to obviously be crushed when that was not the case. But on this day, on October 5th, that phone call that came through in Nathan's sister's home, that one was different. When Nathan's mother picked up this phone call in Nathan's sister's home, she answered it and said hello, and right away she thought, oh, this has to be a wrong number, because the person who was calling was speaking in rapid Spanish and she didn't understand what they were saying. But as she was about to hang up, the caller, intermittently throughout their rapid Spanish, began saying something in English that Nathan's mother could understand, and it totally shocked her. The caller kept saying Nathan's sister's name over and over again, followed by Nathan's sister's phone number, like on repeat, the name, the phone number in English over and over and over again. And Nathan's mom is so caught off guard by this that she just listened, not even sure what to do. And then before she could ask any follow-up questions, the caller cut the line and the phone call was over. And then a few minutes later, another phone rang in a home that was not far away from Nathan's sister's home. And this other home belonged to the boat owner who Billy Joe had rented the fishing boat from that unfortunately sank and caused this whole tragedy. And so this boat owner, he picks up the phone, he answers it, and just like the call that had come through in Nathan's sister's house, this call was the same. It was somebody calling, speaking rapid Spanish, and the boat owner was about to hang up when he heard something that he understood because it was in English. And what he heard was his own name followed by his phone number over and over and over again. Basically the same type of call that Nathan's mom had just heard. And then before the boat owner could ask any questions, the line went dead. Now, one phone call like this, you could chalk up to maybe a prank or a wrong number or just a really weird coincidence. But to have those two calls happen within minutes of each other and basically take on the exact same form, but different names and different phone numbers, it just seemed way too coincidental to not be somehow connected to the missing fishermen. Because the link between these two households where these calls came in was the doomed fishing trip. And these calls did not stop. Every few weeks after this first time these calls came through, the phone would ring in Nathan's sister's house or in the boat owner's house, and it would be the same thing all over again. Rapid Spanish followed by either Nathan's sister's name and then her phone number, or the boat owner's name and his phone number. Just like that for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so as soon as this started happening, Nathan's family and the boat owner, they figured out they were both getting these weird calls, and they contacted authorities, which kind of restarted the search for Billy Joe and the missing fishermen, because now it seemed very plausible that maybe Nathan really had seen a freighter, and that freighter really had picked up Billy Joe and the others, and maybe they had been taken to another country, a Spanish-speaking country, and maybe people were trying to get in touch with the families now to get them back home. Or, of course, there could be a negative side to this, that maybe they were captured by some rogue vessel and were being held by these people who were calling. I mean, there's any number of theories, but it made authorities wonder, hey, what's going on here? And so authorities got in touch with Mexican authorities and other Spanish-speaking country authorities and tried to figure out if there was any chance that there was, a vessel out there around the time that Billy Joe and the others were missing that in theory could have maybe illegally been in that area or something. But despite this kind of exhaustive effort to kind of look again to see if maybe there was a freighter in that area, there was just no evidence that there was. It made no sense, but the authorities said, look, we have no idea what these calls are about. We still do not think that freighter or any ship that even resembled a freighter was out there. We still believe that Billy Joe and the others are dead. But as for the victims' families, they just didn't buy that. They really believed that these strange phone calls were somehow connected to Billy Joe and the missing fishermen. Specifically, these calls must signal that Billy Joe and the others were still alive. They just had no evidence to support that. That is, until March 6th, 1991, so almost a year after the doomed fishing vessel sank and Billy Joe and the others went missing. On that day, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home, and she answered it, and it was the voice who spoke in rapid Spanish, but this time they spoke in perfect English, and all they said was, "I'm bringing him home." And then the line went dead. And Nathan's sister screamed and she yelled for her husband to call police. They contacted the authorities. And again, it kind of brought back to life the search for Billy Joe and the missing fishermen. And then after this call, there was a near constant presence of authorities on the Georgia coastline, basically looking out to the water, waiting, hoping for Billy Joe and the others to return. But unfortunately, they never did. And following that last phone call where the caller spoke in perfect English and said, "I'm bringing him home," after that, the call stopped. And so to this day, no one has ever been able to actually figure out what happened to Billy Joe and the other two fishermen. They are presumed dead at this point, but there's this one nagging question that surrounds the whole story, and that is, what did Nathan see? Was that actually a freighter picking up Billy Joe and the others? And if so, what did they do with them? Or was Nathan just hallucinating? It's entirely possible, but Nathan has always said he knows what he saw, and that was not a hallucination. As for the families of the victims, they still firmly believe that their loved ones are still out there, and someday they will come back home, and the families just hope they're alive long enough to be there for the reunion.